Hi there, in this video we're going to continue building the Svelte and Django application. So far we have on this application a list page to list out all the films in the database. We also have a detail page displaying details for an individual film that's pulled from the ID in the URL, and we also have an add film form here, and that submits a post request to the backend in order to add a film to the database. We're going to finish this CRUD API in this video by adding endpoints that allow us to delete and update an existing film. And as well as that, we're going to bring tags into this application using Django target on the back end, and we're going to apply tags to each movie in the list and then show how we can filter the list of movies by the tag that the user selects. So let's dive in and get started. There's a GitHub repository that's linked in the description, and that contains the code from the last video if you want to follow along. We're going to start by showing how to delete an existing film from the database and thereby remove it from this application. So let's start by bringing up VS Code. I have the film list component in Svelte here. And we're not going to do anything fancy to this UI. If we go back to the page, what I want to do next to the view button that you see here, I just want to add another button that allows the user to delete the film. So let's go back to Svelte and we're going to show how to do that just now. If we scroll down to the HTML, this is the button here that says view. We're going to add another button right here just below that original button. It's actually an anchor tag, but it has the classes of button and button primary from Bootstrap. So below that, let's define a button, and we're going to add a click event to that button that's going to execute some code in our Svelte component. So when the button is clicked, we're going to execute this function here, and it's going to call a function in the component called handle delete, and it's going to pass the film's ID to that particular function. And the film object, we are iterating over these using an each loop here, and each one of the films we get is aliased as a film here, and that's what we access here when we pass the film's ID. So that's our button. I'm going to give it some styles here by using the classes from Bootstrap, and we're going to give that button a class of button danger, and that's going to make it appear red on the user interface. And then we'll give the button some text here. We're just going to say delete, and then we can close off that element. So what we need to do now, when this button is clicked, we need to actually define the function handle delete that's going to be executed when that event does occur on the DOM. So at the top, underneath the onMount function, what we're going to do is define a second function, and we're going to call that handle delete. So let me reference that function here, and that's going to be a function that takes the film's ID. And for now, let's just console.log that ID to the terminal. So let's go back to our application here. I'm going to bring up the console here on the right hand side in the developer tools, and you can see the button here that has appeared on the UI. When we click that, we get the ID of the given film appearing in the console. So that's great, that's working. What we need to do now is we need to actually call the Django backend with a delete request, and that's a type of HTTP request. So we're going to send that delete request to Django, and Django is going to take the ID that's sent in that request, and it's going to remove that object from the database. And when we get a successful response to that delete request, we want to remove the given film also from the Svelte Store that is storing these objects on the front end. So let's start with Django. What we're going to do is go back to VS Code, and I'm going to load up the Django views.py file. And remember, in the last video we defined this model viewset subclass, and the model viewset will automatically provide an endpoint that allows you to send a delete request in order to delete an entity, and it's the entity that's tied to the model viewset, and in our case that's the film model in the application. And we can actually see an example of this in the Django REST framework browsable API. I have the list view open here, and this is listing out all of the films in the database in JSON format. This is the response that we get when we call this endpoint. Now we have a film here with the ID of 2. If I go to the URL and put that ID in there, we get the detail page here, and this is the response for an individual film when we send a GET request to that URL. But you can see we have other options at the top here. We can also send a delete request to this URL, and that's going to delete that film instance from the database. And we have access also to a put request at the bottom here in order to update the film as well. We're going to use that later in the video. But basically all of these endpoints, or all of these HTTP methods, are available on the endpoint that contains the instance ID, and that's because we've added a model viewset. Now we can quickly take a look at the documentation for the model viewset. We did use this in the last video, but I didn't really explain much about it. But the actions that this class provides include the list action, the retrieve action, the create action for creating a new object, but we also have update and destroy actions. These are tied to put requests and delete requests. So when you extend a model view set, you will get those actions by default, and that allows you to very quickly create these CRUD APIs that are surrounding or tied to particular models in a Django application. Now it's this destroy action here that we're going to use in this particular request. We're sending a delete request to Django, and that's going to then delete the film from the database. So we already have an endpoint that will allow us to do this. We just need to pass the film ID in and send a delete request to this URL. So let's go back to the Svelte component, and what we're going to do is wire up that request now. So what I'm going to do is remove the console log statement here, and I'm going to define an endpoint that is linked to the /films/ID. We can then send a fetch request to this endpoint, and we're going to add a JavaScript object here and state that the method for this request is going to be a delete request, so we need to specify delete here. So that's the fetch request. To get the response, we can use the .then function, and that will give us access to this response here. And when you send a delete request to the backend, it's going to delete that object from the database, and it's going to return an HTTP status code of 204, which stands for no content. So the HTTP response is not going to send back any data, but what we can do in this body here is we can check if the response.status is equal to 204. And if that's the case, we know that the delete request has been successful. And what we can then do is we can take the film store that we have, and that was imported at the top here, and that defines the list of films that we have in the application at a given time. We can take that film store and we can call its update method, and the update method, as we've seen before, that takes the previous state of the store, and then we can update the store accordingly to respond to any actions that have occurred. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the previous state of the store, and we're going to use all of those objects which are in a JavaScript array. We can call the array.filter method, and for each film in the store we're going to check if that film's ID is equal to, or rather if it's not equal to, the ID that was passed into the handle delete function. So what's going on here is we take the array of JavaScript objects of films in our store, and we want to keep all of those objects except the one whose ID has been deleted. So we look at all of the film IDs, and as long as the ID is not equal to the ID that's been deleted, we're going to keep that in the store, and we're only going to delete the one film who has an ID that was actually passed to the handle delete function. So I hope that makes sense. What we're going to do is test this out just now. If we go back to the Svelte application, I'm going to minimize the console here, and let's say we want to remove Chinatown from the database. We can click the delete button, and you can see that that has been removed from the list page. But has it been removed from the database? We can go to the API response on the list page here, and I'm going to refresh this, and you can see we only get these two objects. We're no longer getting Chinatown, and that means it's been removed from the database. And when we get the response for the list API view here, we don't get Chinatown because it's been removed from the database. And that's basically all we need to do to wire up a delete request and remove these objects from the database. In a real application, when you click the delete button, you might actually want to get a confirmation pop up, because it's very easy to accidentally click that button and you might accidentally remove objects from the database that you don't want to remove. So having some sort of confirmation would make sense in a real application. So let's now add one final route. We're going to add an update route that's going to send a put request to Django. Now we want to update a film from its detail page. So let's say we have this detail page for the Godfather. We want to show a button here that allows us to update the film. So that button is going to be added to the detail page. So in order to get that, we go to this ID route, and we can go to the page.svelte file. And if we go down to the HTML just within this component, I'm just going to add an update button right at the bottom of this code here. And actually I'm going to add an anchor tag here, and that has an href that is going to link to this page in the Svelte client-side application. So it's /films/film.id, so that's a dynamic ID for this film on the detail page. And then we have a new URL called /update. So what we're going to do is define a Svelte component for the update route, and that's because we need to provide a form that allows the user to actually send the updated details to the server. So we're going to do that in a dedicated component here, and that anchor tag just has the text of update, and again we're adding some button classes from Bootstrap. So let's save this component, and I'm going to go back to this page. You can see the update button. When we click that, we want to be taken to an update page. That doesn't exist at the moment. We're getting a 404 not found. So we need to go back to the application, and we need to go back to the routes here and define this new route in the application. So we have the ID route here. What I'm going to do is define another subfolder within that, and we'll call that update, and that matches the route that we defined here in this anchor tag. And again, we can create a page.svelte file in order to define this component. And we're also going to need a page.js file. So plus page.js, and this is going to export the load function that's going to send some data into this component when it loads. And the reason that we need that, if we go back to this anchor tag here, we're going to be accessing a film ID, so we need to export that and retrieve that within the component. Now we've already done this for the detail root, which is in this directory. There's a page.js file here. I'm going to copy that and we can paste that code into this function. It's doing the exact same thing. The load function returns an object of data that can be accessed by the component, the page.svelte file here, which we're going to do in a second. And whatever you return from this object is going to be available. We're returning the ID from the URL, and that's so that we know which particular film we're dealing with when we have this update page for the component. So let's go back to the page.svelte file. We're going to define a script tag here. Now this component is going to be very similar to the add a film page. If we go back to the application, this is the add film page here that contains a form. We need something very similar for the update page, and that's because when we update a film, we are going to be sending the same data to the server, and that's the name, director, and so on. So we need a form that's very similar to this, and a lot of the logic is going to be very similar as well. So let's go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is just copy everything from this add film component, and we're going to copy that and paste it into this new update component. So let's remove those script tags and just paste in everything from the add film component. And the add film component was here in this directory structure under the add directory. It's the page.svelte file. Now we need to fix a few things in this component. The film store that we're importing, that's a relative import, and that's one directory back compared to the add component. So add another directory backwards here to the import, and that should then work. And we actually need one more piece of code in this component, as well as the code from the add component. I need to also get the onMount call from the detail page. So I'm going to copy this from the detail page, and we're going to paste that in at the bottom, just underneath that handle submit function. Let's paste that in there. The reason we need the onMount function is because when this update component loads, we need to then fetch the correct film in order to know what details we already have for that film. Because remember, this is an update view, so we're going to update existing details, so we need to fetch those existing details. We're going to do that in the onMount call. Now what we're going to do at the top is we're going to get the data that's exported from that load function we just defined. So that's just the ID, we need to get access to that. So what I'm going to do in the update component is we're going to just export let data here, and that gives us access to that data from the load function. And I'm going to create another variable placeholder for the ID of the film that we want to fetch. And that ID will come from the URL, so it's the ID of the film that we want to update. So to start with, we're going to work on the changes for the onMount function. It's not going to be exactly the same as the detail page. What we're going to do in here is going to set the ID equal to data.id from what's exported here. So we have an ID key within that object. We're going to access that here to set the ID on the onMount function. And we also need a film here, so let's create a variable called film that we're going to set to an empty object. Now the film store will contain an array of films. If there's any length there, in other words, if there are films in that store, we're going to try and find that by the ID that's passed in. So we need to change this to ID at the end here. So we're looking up the film by its ID. Otherwise, we can send the request to the endpoint that will return that film's JSON data based on the ID that's passed in the URL. And we can keep this logic exactly the same. But what we want to do at the end of the if and else block here is we want to set the values of each field in the film to the values in this component. So we have these fields here for different values on this individual film, the name of the film, the director of the film, and the description of the film. And we also have the files here that we're going to deal with a bit later on. So what we're doing in the onMount function is we are setting an empty object for the film, and then we are filling in that film with the correct data based on either what's in the store or what we get back from the API. So this film object will contain the film data with the fields. What we're going to do is then set these values of name, director, and description from that film object. So let's scroll down to the bottom of onMount, and we can do this with a shorthand syntax. So I'm going to use the name, director, and description variables here, and let's set them equal to the fields that are on that film object. So this is a shorthand syntax for writing name equals film.name and then writing the same for director, director equals film.director, and also the same for the description. You could write description equals film.description. This is a shorthand way of writing all of these statements, and that's because the variables that we're setting are equal to fields that we have on this JavaScript object. So the name, director, and description are going to be set from that data, and then that will then show in these variables, and that will then show on the form because of the binding that we have. So let's save this, and that's all we need to do in the onMount function. Basically, we fetch the film, and we're setting these variables in the Svelte component to the actual data for that film. Let's now tackle the handle submit function here, and there's quite a few things we need to change in this function. First of all, we need to change the endpoint here. This is going to be a put request that's going to change the data for an individual film. So we need to add the film's ID to this endpoint. And we can do that by accessing film.id, and we need to use a template string in order to do this. So I'm going to change these strings to template strings in JavaScript, and that allows us to reference a variable directly within the template string. So we've added the ID to the endpoint that we're going to call in the handle submit function. We can keep all of this the same. We're appending the field's values to the form data object that we're going to send in the put request. We do need to change what's being called here in the fetch request. We need to change the method to a put request, and then when we send that put request, we get back the JSON data for the updated object, and that data will then be available in this callback here when the promise resolves. We need to change the logic of this because we are no longer going to be updating the film store and adding a new object. What we're going to be doing instead is we're going to be updating an existing object in the store. So what I'm going to do is change the body of this film store.update function, and we can define the function with the curly braces here because we're going to execute more than one statement within this callback. Now what I'm going to do in this body is define a variable called updated films, and we're going to reference the value in the film store. And remember, we can get access to the existing value by prepending the film store with the $. We can get access to that, and we can copy it by calling .slice. And when you call .slice on a JavaScript array and you don't pass any arguments to that function, what that's going to do is return a copy of that array. So we have a copy of that array of films now stored in this variable called updated films. What we can now do is find the index of the film that we want to update in that store. So we're going to take that updated films copy, and we're going to call the find index function that's defined on JavaScript arrays. And this function takes a predicate as the first argument, and that predicate allows you to find the particular index that you're interested in. So the predicate we're going to provide is a callback function. We're going to take each film, and we're going to look for the film whose ID is equal to the data.id parameter, and that's the ID from the URL on this component. So each film has an ID. We're looking for the film with the same ID that's in the URL, and the find index function is going to give us back the index of the object that contains that ID. Once we have the index, we can then index into the updated films using that index here, and then we can reset it to the data that we get back from this put request. So when we send the put request, we send all of the data that we want to update. Django will then take the put request and perform that operation on the back end and update the data in the database. And then it will return the updated data to the client, which is this function here. And we can then update the value of the film at the given index with that data. And the final thing we need to do in order to reset the state in our film store is just return that updated films copy in order to reset that data. Now there's one other bit of code I want to change, and that's this code here where we append the image, and that's based on the file list that's been selected or the file that's been chosen on the form. So if we go back to the browser here, we have this option to choose a file, and by default no file will be chosen. What I want to do is make sure that the user has added a file here before we send that file in the put request, and that's to avoid overwriting an existing image with a null value if the user has not selected an image here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if files is equal to a value, and only if files is not null will we append the index of 0 here to this image key in the form data object up here. And files will only be not null if the user has selected a file, and that's because if we go down to the file field here, it's bound to that particular field on the Svelte component, and we're going to check that here in our handle submit function. If we have a value in there, we're going to append it to the form data, otherwise we're going to do nothing to that field to avoid it being overwritten. Now that leaves open the possibility that when we send the put request, the form data will not send an image to the server. So we need to go back to Django now, and I'm going to go to the serializers.py file. This is the film serializer that's responsible for taking the films and converting them to JSON. And also when we send the body of JSON data to Django, this is going to be responsible for converting that data to a film object. And what we need to do here is tell Django that the image field is optional. It might not be sent from the front end. In order to do that, I'm going to define the field here, and it's going to be equal to a serializers.image field. And I'm going to pass required equals false to that field. And that's going to allow us to not send the image field when we actually send a put request to the back end. So let's actually test this out and go back to our Svelte application. I'm going to go to the film list page, and let's go to this film here, the Big Lebowski. If we click update, we're getting an error on the right hand side. It's a reference error. On mount is not defined. So let's go back to the update component now, and I need to import that at the top. So let's import from Svelte the on mount lifecycle hook. And again, let's go back to the page here, and this time you see that when the page is loaded, we have access to all of the film data that exists currently for that page. So we have the film name of the Big Lebowski. Let's try and change that to something else and submit this, and we're getting an error here that the film is not defined. So let's go back to the component, and we're going to try and figure out what's going on here. So we have the film ID in the endpoint that we have in the handle submit function, but the film itself is not defined. We can actually remove that and just reference the ID here. Now why is that? We have the ID in the Svelte component, and initially that is null, but that value is then set within the on mount lifecycle hook. So when the component is loaded, the ID is set here by looking at the data.id attribute, and we can then use that ID directly in the URL for this endpoint. So let's now try this again. I'm going to save this file and go back to the update page here. And if we try and submit this with some new data, you can see we are now redirected back to the list page. And I'm going to close the console here, and we can get this new title for the film in the list page here. If we go to view that, you can see we can also see that new title in the detail page, and we can again go back and update that back to the correct value, but maybe change some other data in the component here, and you can see that also is updated. And if we go back and try and change the image that's used, I'm going to select a new image just now. So this is the Big Lebowski, but I'm going to select the Chinatown image here. If we select that and submit that to the server, you can see that it updates the image as well. So I'm going to change this data back on the update page, and then we can summarize exactly what's going on that page. So let's select the correct film here, which was the Big Lebowski, and submit that data. Now if we go back to the component, let's explain what's going on here one more time. In the on mount hook here, what we're doing is we're fetching the correct film either from the store or from the API, and then we're extracting the field values from that film for the name, the director, and the description, so that we can store them in the component variables at the top here, which means that they are automatically shown on the update page. So for example, going back to the Big Lebowski update page, we can see these values in the form fields, and that's because we are extracting them and setting these values, which are then bound to these input fields. When we submit the form with the new data, that will call the handle submit function. So if we go back up to handle submit, what's happening here is we run the same validation that we did in the last video on the form data, and then we define this endpoint that will send a put request to an endpoint that contains the ID of the film we want to update. We add the values to the form data object from the form, and then we are sending a fetch request, and that's a put request that attaches that body of data to the request, and then Django on the back end will take that and it will update the data in the database because it's using this model view set that contains a handler for these put requests, and that handler will take care of updating the database and returning the response containing the new data for that film. And then we are updating the film store by calling its update function, and what we're doing in the body of that update function is we copy the existing state of the store, and then we are finding by its index the film whose ID has been updated, and we are replacing that film at that index with the data that's coming back from the API and returning the newly updated state as the new value of the store. So I hope that makes sense for the update page. I'll put this code on GitHub in the _4 directory if you want to look at it. That's going to be all for this video. I think at the start of the video I said we'd add tags and Django tag it to the video, but I'm actually going to do that in the next video instead. I think this video is long enough and the tagging stuff is going to be very specific. It's nothing to do with what we've done in this video. So we'll add that in the next video. And after that, if you have any other requests for anything new, for example, do you want to see authentication between Svelte and Django? Do you want to see form validation? Maybe you want to see more about things like server-side rendering. If you have any requests, let me know in the comments. But again, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're enjoying this content, please consider buying a coffee for the channel. And we'll see you in the next video.